My son sent me a text message 4 days before his gallery opening. Not a call. A text. 11 words. Dad, I think it's better if you don't come Saturday. I read it 3 times, standing in my kitchen in Kelowna, still in my work boots, coffee going cold on the counter. 11 words. After 62 years of living, after 31 years of being his father, after every check I'd written, and every drive I'd made, and every Saturday morning I'd spent sitting in the back of some cold community center, watching him show his paintings to 12 people who didn't buy anything. 11 words on a phone screen. I'm not a man who cries easily. Ask anyone who knows me, but I sat down at that kitchen table and I just stared at the wall for a long time. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I built. Holt Westside Supply. Commercial kitchen equipment, restaurant fit-outs, institutional food service contracts across the Okanagan and into the Lower Mainland. I started it in 1991 out of a rented bay in a light industrial park off Highway 97. Just me and a second-hand truck and a Rolodex I'd borrowed philosophy from my father about. Return every call, show up when you say you will, remember what people need before they have to ask twice. 33 years later, we supply over 200 hospitality accounts. Hotels, restaurants, event venues, university dining halls. If you've eaten at a catered event in the Thompson-Okanagan corridor in the last decade, there's a reasonable chance the equipment that made your food was installed by someone on my crew. My son. I'll call him my son because that's what he is, whatever he's decided I am to him. He's 34 now. Name is Fenwick. Fen for short, which I called him since he was 3 years old running around the backyard in Rutland. His mother and I divorced in 2007. Amicable enough, all things considered. We both loved him more than we'd stopped loving each other, which I think is the best you can say about a divorce when there's a kid in the middle of it. After the split, I made a decision that I never questioned and never resented, until recently. Fen would not feel the financial weight of what his mother and I had broken. I would not let our failure become his limitation. So, I kept the numbers, the way businessmen do. Not out of bitterness, out of habit. His foundation year at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, $18,000 in tuition and residence. Because Vancouver is not a cheap city, and art school is not a cheap dream. 2 more years after that when he transferred programs, the studio apartment in Mount Pleasant for 4 years at $2,100 a month. My bank account. His address. The cargo van he needed to move large canvases, which I bought him outright for $14,000 because he said he couldn't find reliable transport. The art materials, which run higher than people imagine. Quality canvas, specific pigments, framing. I'd estimate $40 to $60 a month most months, more during installation periods. A solo show in 2019 that I co-funded because the gallery in Gastown required the artist to cover a portion of the hanging costs and he didn't have it. $800. I didn't think twice. Add it up honestly, and you're somewhere north of $240,000 over 12 years. I kept the records not to hold over him. I kept them because I'm a businessman and that's how I'm wired. I didn't expect a return. I expected, I suppose, to be treated like a person who mattered. The shift was gradual. I can't pinpoint a single moment. It was the way he'd started talking about his career in interviews. And yes, he'd given a few interviews to regional arts publications, which I'd read all of and saved, using phrases like self-funded and built from nothing and relying on my own resources. It was the way he'd started referring to his mother's new partner, a man named Aldous, who teaches art history at UBC and wears linen shirts and speaks in complete paragraphs about things like negative space and curatorial intent as his primary influence. It was the way, at my brother's retirement dinner 2 years ago, Fen had leaned across the table to explain to my brother's wife what I did for a living as though it were mildly embarrassing. He does, commercial equipment, supply chain stuff. It's not very interesting. While Aldous sat at the other end of the table holding court about a Basquiat retrospective he'd seen in Montreal, I told myself I was reading too much into things. Then came this gallery opening. The gallery is called Meridian Collective. It's in a renovated heritage building on Water Street in Vancouver, one of the nicer exhibition spaces in the city. Exposed brick, 12-foot ceilings, the kind of place that charges a premium on the artist side and delivers genuine foot traffic on the opening night. Then had been working toward this show for 2 years. 31 original works. His most ambitious project. I'd heard about it in pieces over the phone. The concept, the scale, the artist statement he'd workshopped with Aldous. I'd also, quietly, done something I hadn't told Fen about yet. Meridian Collective does a lot of private events. Corporate receptions, fundraising galas, member dinners. For events of any scale, they need catering. And catering, in Vancouver, means equipment, chafers, induction burners, prep surfaces, hot boxes, portable refrigeration. 3 years ago, Meridian Collective signed a service agreement with Holt Westside Supply. We supply and maintain their event kitchen equipment. We've renewed that agreement twice. Their events coordinator, a woman named June, sharp and organized and the kind of person who sends thank you notes, has told me more than once that we're the most reliable vendor she works with. Fen did not know this. He'd never asked how I built the contacts I had in Vancouver, because he'd never really thought of me as having contacts in Vancouver. I was, in his mental landscape, a man from Kelowna who sold refrigeration units. What would that have to do with his world? Beyond the gallery, there's the catering company handling the opening night reception, Pemberton and Voss Fine Catering. I've supplied them for 6 years. Their owner, a man called Jeffrey, and I go back to a time when he was running a much smaller operation and needed equipment financing I helped him secure. I've attended 2 of his son's hockey games because his son played against my nephew, and that's how these things work in the communities where people actually know each other. The printing company producing Fen's exhibition catalog and promotional materials, Cascadia Print and Design in Burnaby. My company handles the institutional printing contract for 3 of their largest clients. The owner knows my name. And the opening night PR firm, the one Fen's gallerist had brought in to generate press coverage, get the right people through the door, write the media release. I had known their senior account manager for 11 years. We'd sat on the same Chamber of Commerce subcommittee in 2016. I didn't know all of this when Fen's text arrived. I worked some of it out afterward, but I had enough instinct, after 33 years in commercial supply, to understand the shape of the network before I mapped it precisely. I sat on the text for 24 hours. I didn't respond. I called my accountant. Not for advice, just to think out loud to someone who wouldn't flinch. And I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Gordon, what do you actually want out of this?" I thought about that for a long time. I didn't want revenge. That's not the right word, and I want to be precise about this because what happened next is easy to misread. What I wanted was for my son to understand that there are consequences to treating people as though they are invisible, not painful consequences I invented out of spite, natural consequences, the kind that exist in the world already, waiting because the world is more connected than people who spent their lives being supported realize. I called Fen the next morning. He picked up on the 3rd ring. He sounded distracted, which had become his default register when talking to me. The voice of someone who is technically present but already mentally composing an exit. I told him I'd gotten his text. I asked him to explain it to me like I was someone whose understanding mattered, not like I was a problem to be managed. He sighed. The sigh of a man who'd rehearsed this. He said that the opening was an important, professional event, that the gallery's collector base was sophisticated, he used that word, sophisticated, and that he'd been advised by Aldous and by the gallerist that mixing family into professional openings could create the wrong impression, that he wanted people to see his work on its own terms, not filtered through the presence of, and here he paused just long enough for me to feel it land. You know, the commercial side of things. The commercial side of things. I'd funded the man's entire adult life, and I was the commercial side of things. I asked him directly, was I being excluded from my own son's gallery opening because the people advising him had decided I wasn't the right kind of person to be seen at a sophisticated event? He said I was being reductive. I said I was being accurate. Was I invited or not? He said the guest list was carefully curated, that the gallerist, her name was Isadora, and she'd apparently been very clear about keeping the opening to collectors, press, and professional contacts, had strongly recommended keeping it tight. I said, I'm your father. I've supported your career financially for 12 years. Am I or am I not invited to your gallery opening? There was a pause. Then he said, Dad, you wouldn't really enjoy it. It's not really your scene. Not my scene. I said, I'll call you back. I didn't call him back that day. I called June at Meridian Collective instead. June picked up immediately and was warm in the way she always is. We made small talk about a service call we had scheduled for the following week. Then I mentioned, gently, that my son was showing at their gallery this coming Saturday. She paused. Fenwick Holt, that's your son? Yes, I said. And I mentioned, equally gently, that I was reviewing our service agreement renewal. It came up every 18 months, and that I wanted to make sure we were aligned on terms before I signed anything further, nothing threatening in that. It was true, we were due for a renewal conversation. She said, of course, whenever I was ready, she'd loop in their operations manager. I called Jeffrey at Pemberton and Voss the next morning. He answered on the first ring. We talked about his son, who'd apparently committed to a university program in environmental engineering, which Jeffrey was proud of in the way that fathers are proud when their children exceed their expectations. I congratulated him. Then I mentioned that I'd been doing a review of our service relationships and that I was going to need to make some decisions about contract renewals before end of quarter. He asked if there was anything specific prompting it. I said, personal circumstances. A situation that's made me think carefully about which professional relationships I want to continue investing in. He didn't push. Business people understand the sentence, I'm reassessing my commitments, as a full and complete thought. I called my contact at the PR firm that afternoon. I didn't mention the opening. I mentioned that I was considering pulling together a Holt West Side Supply corporate event in the spring and that I'd been meaning to call to talk about scope and fit. We had a good conversation, the kind that builds goodwill. Then I called Fen. He picked up sounding slightly more cautious than he had before. Word travels in small professional networks, even when it travels quietly. I told him I had one question and I needed an honest answer. Was I being excluded from his opening because the people advising him had decided I didn't fit the image they were trying to build around his work? He said, and I give him some credit for this, it was the most honest he'd been in the conversation. Aldous thinks it's important for the brand of my practice to be independent. And Isadora agreed, and Mom backed them up. I said, your mother? He said, she thinks it's better for the long-term relationship with collectors if they don't associate you with the work. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, Fen, I want you to tell me something. Do you know that Meridian Collective is one of my accounts? Silence. I said, do you know that Pemberton and Voss, the caterers doing your opening night reception, have been supplied by Holt Westside for 6 years? More silence. I said, do you know that Cascadia Print, who did your catalogs, work with 3 of my institutional clients? His voice changed. What are you saying? I said, I'm saying that the world you work in is not as separate from the world I work in as Aldous and Isadora have led you to believe. I'm saying that the commercial side of things, the part you're apparently embarrassed by, is threaded through your career in ways you've never looked closely enough to see. He said, Dad, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to respect your decision, Fen. You've told me I'm not welcome at your opening. I'm going to think carefully about what that means for my professional commitments, in the same way you've clearly thought carefully about what it means for your guest list. He said, that's a threat. I said, it's a consequence. There's a difference. You've decided that the support I provide should exist in a separate compartment from your professional life, invisible, never acknowledged, certainly never visible at an event where it might complicate your brand. I'm telling you that compartments don't work that way, not in business and not in family. He said, I need to think. I said, you have until Thursday morning. That's when I planned to sign the Meridian renewal paperwork. I hung up. Thursday came. I hadn't heard from Fen. I hadn't heard from his mother. I had received a text from Aldous. How he got my number, I don't know, though I can guess. That said, in its entirety, Gordon, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Happy to meet for coffee. I didn't reply. Thursday morning at 9, I called June at Meridian. I told her I decided not to renew the service agreement at this time. I told her I appreciated the relationship and that I'd give her the full contractual notice period and make the transition as smooth as possible, but that my circumstances had changed. She was professional, disappointed, genuinely. I could hear it. She asked if there was anything that could be addressed. I said it was personal. At 9:15, I called Jeffrey. I told him I needed to pause our contract discussions and that I'd be winding down the current service arrangement per our agreement terms. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is about Fen's opening, isn't it? Not a question." I said, "Jeffrey, you have a son. You know what it costs to be told you don't belong at something your child built with your support?" He said, "I do know." And then, "I'm sorry, Gordon. That's not right." At 9:30, I called Cascadia Print and moved 3 of my referral accounts to a competitor. I didn't call the PR firm. I'd already done enough, and I don't believe in excess. My phone started ringing at noon. Isadora first, the gallerist, who was composed but clearly alarmed, explaining that they were experiencing some complications with their service relationships and asking if I might know anything about it. I told her I was sorry to hear that and that I hoped it resolved itself. Then Fawn. He was not composed. "Dad, the gallery is saying their equipment contract fell through. Jeffrey's saying there might be issues with the catering. The catalog printer, they're saying some of their main clients are going elsewhere. Do you know what's happening?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you decided that my presence would be inconvenient to your career, and I decided to take that seriously." He said, "This is insane. This is my career. You could ruin everything I've built." I said very quietly, "Everything you've built." He stopped. I said then, "I have every wire transfer, every rent payment, every equipment purchase, every course fee going back 12 years. I have $240,000 in documented support for a career that you describe publicly as self-funded and that you've decided I'm too embarrassing to be seen near. I want you to think about that for a moment before you tell me what you've built." The silence on the line was different from the silences before. This one had weight. He said slowly, "I didn't know about the gallery contract. I didn't know about Jeffrey." I said, "Of course you didn't. Because you've never been curious about how the world I live in touches the world you live in. You assumed they were separate. That's the assumption I'm correcting." He said, "What do I have to do?" I said, "You can start by answering honestly. Do you actually believe I'm an embarrassment to your work? Or have you been told that by people whose opinion matters more to you than your own?" A long pause. Then, "I've been told that. I think I believed it because it was easier than pushing back." I said, "Easier than pushing back on Aldous?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "That's honest. I appreciate honest." He said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm actually sorry. Is there anything I can do?" I told him I'd think about it. I told him that an apology was a start, but that what I actually needed was for him to understand that the version of himself that had sent that text, the version that had decided his father was best kept invisible, was not the man I'd raised and not the man I believed he still was, underneath the borrowed vocabulary of people who'd never written him a single check. He called back that evening and asked me to come to the opening. I told him I'd come if he introduced me honestly. Not as a family member from the interior or my dad. He's in supply chain with a wave of the hand. As his father, the man who'd supported his work for 12 years. I told him I wasn't asking to be displayed like a trophy. I was asking to be treated like a person who mattered. He said, "I can do that." The opening was the following Saturday. I drove down from Kelowna Friday evening and stayed at a hotel on Granville Street. I booked it myself, didn't mention it to Fen, didn't make it about logistics or gestures, just handled my own affairs the way I always have. The gallery was full by 7. 31 paintings on cream white walls, the kind of natural light from the skylights that makes color sit differently than it does under artificial light. I stood in front of one of the larger pieces, ochre and deep green and something almost black at the center. And I understood, standing there, that my son was genuinely talented. That part had never been in question. What had been in question was whether talent entitled a person to be cruel to the people who made space for it to develop. Aldous was there. We shook hands. He was polite. I was polite. I didn't need him to know what had happened. He would work it out eventually if he was as perceptive as his reputation suggested. Isadora, the gallerist, introduced herself to me near the wine table. She said, "You must be Fenwick's father. He speaks highly of you." I thanked her for saying so. I didn't mention the service contract. June from Meridian found me by the catering table. Jeffrey's team was there. Everything had been sorted. I had agreed to suspend the cancellations once Fen had called and asked me honestly. And she put her hand on my arm and said, "I'm glad this worked out. I didn't fully understand what had happened, but I'm glad." I thanked her. Fen found me near the end of the evening when the crowd had thinned to the people who were still buying wine and talking quietly in clusters. He stood beside me looking at the same painting I'd been looking at, the ochre one, and he said, "That one's called Kelowna Light. I painted it after that summer I spent at yours in 2019. When you let me use the garage as a studio, I hadn't known that." He said, "I should have told you." I said, "Yes, you should have." He said, "I got lost in the version of myself that Aldous was building. The self-made artist from nowhere. It felt important to believe it." He paused. "I think I needed to believe I'd done it on my own. And that made you inconvenient." I said, "I understand that. I don't accept it, but I understand it." He said, "Fair." We stood there for a while, not saying anything. Two men in a gallery in Vancouver, looking at a painting named after a city one of them had spent his whole life building something in, while the other had spent years pretending that city didn't explain anything about where he'd come from. His mother called me the following week. She was cooler than Fen had been, more defended. But she said, "I think I made a mistake encouraging him to manage you the way he did. I thought I was protecting his career. I think I was just agreeing with Aldous because it was easier." I said, "I know. We've had a version of this problem our whole marriage. Not defending, just accurate." She said, "I know." 3 weeks later, Fen called me on a Sunday morning, which he almost never did. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd said, about the difference between support and enabling, about what it means to let someone disappear into your blind spot because seeing them clearly complicates your story. He said he'd talked to his gallerist about updating his artist statement, that the new version mentioned his family's support explicitly. Not gushing, just honest. He said, "Is that enough?" I said, "It's a start. The kind of start I can work with." He said, "I want you to come to the next one. The right way. From the beginning." I said, "I'll be there." I signed the Meridian Service Agreement renewal the following Monday. Called Jeffrey and confirmed we were back on track. Called Cascadia and walked 2 of the 3 referrals back, left one with a competitor because it's useful to have options and I'm still a businessman. The painting called Kelowna Light sold opening night for $4,200 to a collector from West Vancouver. I found out from Fen a week later. He said, "I know you helped make that room possible. I want you to know, I know that." I said that's all I ever needed. It is not a complicated thing what I needed. I needed my son to see me. Not the money, not the contracts, not the network, me. The man who'd driven 6 hours one February to sit in a cold community center and watch 12 people not buy his paintings. The man who'd said, every single time they'll come around, keep going. I didn't cancel his opening to punish him. I canceled it to make him look. And when he looked, he saw what I'd known was there all along. Respect isn't a gift you give people when it's convenient. It's the condition under which everything else, the support, the investment, the love, can actually function. Pull respect out of that equation and what's left isn't family. It's just financing. He knows that now. So do I. There's something I've learned about the way consequences work that nobody really teaches you when you're young. They don't arrive loudly. They don't announce themselves. They move the way water moves, quietly, steadily, following the path that's already been carved out by the choices that came before them. What happened between me and my son wasn't the result of one bad text message. It was the result of years of small decisions, his, mine, his mother's, that had been accumulating in the background while everyone pretended the account was balanced. I think about Fen standing in that gallery the night of the opening, looking at the painting he'd named after my city without ever telling me. Kelowna light, ochre and green, and something dark at the center. He'd carried that summer in the garage with him into his work, let it shape something, and then turned around and decided the man who'd handed him the keys to that garage wasn't fit to stand in the room where the painting hung. That contradiction, holding something close while pushing its source away, is not unique to him. I've seen it in business. I've seen it in myself, if I'm being honest. We absorb what people give us and then, sometimes, we rewrite the story of where it came from because the truth of our dependence is uncomfortable to live with. The moral failure in what Fen did wasn't ingratitude in the simple sense. It was intellectual dishonesty. He had built a version of himself, the self-made artist, the independent creative, that required my invisibility to function. And when Aldous and Isadora handed him a framework that made that invisibility respectable, even principled, he took it. Not because he was cruel by nature, because it was easier than the harder work of integrating the truth of where he'd come from into the story he wanted to tell about who he was. That's a failure of character that no amount of talent excuses, and the only honest response to it, the response that actually respects the person who failed rather than simply managing them, is to let them feel the weight of it. I didn't cancel those contracts to punish my son. I want to be clear about that to myself as much as anyone. I did it because I had spent 12 years funding a fiction, and the fiction had finally made a demand I couldn't meet, disappear completely so the story holds. At that point, the only dignified thing left was to stop participating in it. Not with anger, with clarity. What came back from that clarity was something I hadn't expected, a version of my son I recognized. The phone call, where he said I got lost in the version of myself that Aldous was building. That was the first honest sentence he'd spoken to me in years. And it cost him something to say it. That's how I knew it was real. Easy words don't mean much. Words that arrive after a person has had to look squarely at what they've done, those mean something. The resilience required in a situation like this isn't the resilience of enduring mistreatment quietly. That's not strength, that's habit. The resilience I'm talking about is the kind that holds its own position without cruelty, that applies consistent principles without losing sight of the person underneath the behavior, and that stays open, genuinely open to the moment when the other person finally looks up and sees clearly. Fen looked up. That painting sold opening night. He called me a week later to tell me, and the way he said it, "I know you helped make that room possible," was the kind of sentence that closes something and opens something else at the same time. I'll take it. I'll take it and I'll keep going, the way I always have. That's all any of us can really do.